What is the impact of immigration on the federal budget? How does the East Coast Dockworkers Union work? And are union bosses paid too much? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of eConception. eConception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the line to immigrate into the United States legally. This podcast is going to be 5 years long. There are two intuitive economic stories about immigration that both kind of make sense, and they both have opposite conclusions. The first story says that the United States has a demographic problem. We don't have enough people being born here to work, to pay taxes, and pay into retirement systems for the benefits that are promised to people who aren't working, people who are retired. We have an aging population. One way to fix that problem is to have more immigrants come in. They'll be able to work and pay for those benefits. Therefore, immigration is good for the federal budget. The other story says that because a lot of these immigrants are coming across illegally, they are entering the United States and they are not paying taxes, and they are nonetheless in many places eligible for government benefits. They also disproportionately tend to be poorer and more in need of government benefits. Therefore, immigration is bad for the federal budget because they're taking out more than they're putting in. Both of these stories kind of make sense. Daniel D. Martino is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a PhD candidate in economics at Columbia, and he has written a gigantic paper all about the fiscal impact of immigrants in the United States. So I wanted to talk to Daniel about that paper and try to settle this question and figure out exactly what's going on. So thanks for being here, Daniel.
Very happy to be here, Dominic.
So I guess to start off, like I said, there's these two stories that both sort of make sense. You've got people on the more free market side of the question even will sort of have both of these views. Milton Friedman, of course, was famous for saying that you can't have open immigration and a welfare state because immigrants will come in and take advantage of the welfare system and not pay into it. But then, of course, you have lots of free market people as well that see the economic benefits of immigration and want to have more of it. So what is the actual story on how this works?
So remember that the complete quote from Friedman is that he actually said at the end that that's why we want all immigrants to be illegal so that they're not eligible for welfare benefits. And so he was actually like a pro-illegal immigration argument. You know, the thing is that things have changed over time too. And so most people, what they need to know is that the average American is a net liability to the federal government. And that must be the case mathematically, because if you run a budget deficit, the average person must be a deficit by definition. And so that's what I find. The average native-born American over his or her lifetime, from the moment they're born until the moment they likely die, will cost or will be responsible for $250,000 more in spending than in tax revenue. The curious part of this $250K, though, is that only $50K is actually spending and $200K is interest on the debt. And so, you know, basically the primary deficit is $50K per person, and the total deficit with the debt interest is $250. So what I find, though, is that the average immigrant, even with the interest on the debt, is a net surplus of $10,000. That you say, well, that's a great thing. That means that if we just bring in a lot more immigrants, we can solve our budget deficit. And really not at 10,000. It's not. It's too small of a surplus. You will need to bring in such a vast number of people that you would have a lot of cultural and political concerns. And that's why what I did is divide the immigrant population by their education and their age at arrival. And so if you look at, say, immigrants who come to America between the ages of 18 and 24 years old, who go on to obtain a PhD or a master's or become lawyers or physicians, they are a net surplus of over $1.5 million over their lifetime. Now that can close the budget deficit.
Yeah, and in the paper you set out the range of different types of immigrants and their impacts on the budget. So you say the average is a $10,000 surplus, which isn't that large, but there's a huge range on this, right? So the average isn't really representative of what we would be expecting to see in real life. Can you talk about sort of just how wide that range is and what the negative side it looks like and what the positive side looks like?
Yeah, so the most negative side is everybody who has no high school diploma. So say immigrants who came to America at any age, but who never graduated high school. Most of them really cost the federal government more than $400,000 over their lifetime, net of every tax they pay. And this is a group in which illegal immigrants are overrepresented. So the majority of immigrants in this country who do not have a high school diploma are here illegally. And so, while I cannot distinguish in the data who is legal and who is not, I can distinguish education. And if you then separate by country of origin, you can more or less know which one is illegal and which one is not, especially since, like everybody who came before the 80s was legalized by the amnesty. So everybody post is more likely to be legal. If they're from Latin America, even more. If they don't have a high school diploma, even more. And so you can basically adjust by their age and education. And I come up with the estimate that the average illegal immigrant coming to the United States will cost the federal government over $130,000 more in spending than they receive in taxes. And that is even adjusting somewhat for the economic activity that they create in the US. So I do try to adjust for that. And that means that the illegal immigration crisis we're experiencing is actually going to be tremendously costly. I put it at over $1 trillion. And that is important for people to understand because, yes, it's true that illegal immigrants work. It's true that they do pay taxes. The problem is that most people, like about half of taxpayers, don't pay income taxes because we have so many tax credits. We have so many, the tax system is so progressive. And if you're a high school dropout, the amount of money you make is very low. Many of these people, I'm sure, underreport their incomes too. And that is not an attack on illegal immigrants. Like a lot of low-income Americans underreport their own income too. And the consequence is they pay some taxes, but they end up benefiting much more from government services like roads, like Medicaid, like Medicare and Social Security when they grow older. The key to my analysis that differentiates it from other analysis is that I look at the whole life of the person coming to America. Most analysis just focus on the next 10 years or this year. Obviously, if you bring in a 30-year-old, even without high school education, the first year they're here or the first few years that they're here, they're probably going to pay more in taxes than receiving government benefits. But what happens when they reach the age of 65? They're going to receive a lot more medical care. Oh, but they're here illegally. They're not going to get Social Security and Medicare. Well, they might get it in an illegal way because they do pay into it. And so they might use somebody else's Social Security number. But even if they don't get that, they will get emergency health care for free through Medicaid. And that's going to cost money to the federal government. They're going to use the roads, right? They're going to use police. They're going to use the courts. Immigration detention is a cost too. I mean, all of these things cost money.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier research and how your study is different. You're building off of a National Academy of Sciences study that was done in 2017, and you're sort of upgrading, improving some of the process there. Can you describe what the existing research looked like and why you thought it was necessary to do this paper?
Yeah, so two main studies have been done about this that are relevant for us in the US. There's been many more studies in Europe, but that's not very applicable to us because Europe just has different immigrants and very different entitlement and welfare systems. And so in the US, the National Academies of Science had done a study in the 1990s and then recently in the 2010s, looking at the same question I looked at, which is what is the impact of immigration and of immigrants of different characteristics of age and education throughout their lifetime on the finances of the government? They also look at state governments, by the way, which I don't, and we can go into why, but I will in the future, just not in this paper. But the national academies finds also, like me, that the average immigrant is a net benefit to the federal government and that there's huge variation by education. The problem is that their study, one is older now, it's 2012 data. Two, it used data since the 90s until 2012, before Obamacare existed, with different tax rates over time, before Medicare Part D, before the Medicaid expansion. I mean, the welfare state was simply less generous when in the studied period of the national academies. And the immigrants were different too. Immigrants actually have become much more highly skilled since the 2010s. Most people are not aware of this. I have a paper that I'm actually writing for a journal about this specific issue. And so I adjust for all those things. And then the other big change is that this country is much more in debt than it was in 2012. And so this means that this is actually to the advantage of immigrants, by the way, because the thing is, new immigrants are not responsible for past debt. And if you have more people, not just immigrants, more babies, imagine you could have a policy that made Americans have more kids. It's the same type of analysis that I'm making. You would have more people to pay the same amount of debt. This is why the demographic collapse is such a disaster for most developed countries. Because imagine you balance the budget completely. The debt stays constant in real terms, adjusted for inflation. Not even for GDP, but adjusted for inflation. If you have less people, that means more debt per capita. It becomes harder and harder to balance the budget. And so immigration I think, needs to be a part of this debate of how we make sure that the population doesn't fall. But also, let's imagine you say, well, we're going to welcome immigrants. Yeah, but if you welcome all these poor immigrants that are going to become welfare dependents, then you might as well let the population fall. And so the main conclusion from my report is that you need a lot more high-skilled immigration, and you actually need to limit low-skilled immigration, not just illegal, but legal.
So one of the things that you mentioned that a lot of people probably don't know is that that immigration on average has become more high skilled since 2010, which I think is really contrary to a lot of the talking points we hear from a lot of politicians about this. But another thing that I learned from reading your paper that I didn't know is that immigrants live longer than native born Americans, not just by a little bit, but actually kind of by a lot. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and I actually got some criticism of that, even though this is just a fact. Right? I looked at, I'm an economist, but I looked at science journals like medical journals and demographics journals to look at this. And there's data from the Social Security Administration that proves this. We've known this for a long time. This is why people talk about the Hispanic life expectancy paradox, that Hispanics are poorer, but they live longer than non-Hispanics. And people are like, why? Is it their diet? Asians also live much longer. It's actually the immigrant Hispanics that live longer, not the native born. And it's the Asian immigrants, not as much the native born, that live longer, because the native born assimilate. And so what happens is, one, there's positive selection, meaning the people who come here are healthier than the people who stay in their countries. There's just a barrier of entry. First, the U.S. literally bans people with illnesses from coming to America, and disabilities, by the way. So you just have a more selected population. And number two, because immigrants just engage less in behaviors that are likely to get them killed. For example, immigrants are nearly 15% of the US population, but only 8% of homicide victims. We don't know much. We can't tell you for sure who are the people who commit the homicides, because we don't really have immigration data for the criminals, but we do have very easily available data of the victims. The victim is dead, therefore their information becomes public. And so homicide, less overdose deaths of drugs, less accidents of any kind. And as a consequence, they're more likely to survive, but in their working age years. So, if they were just more likely to survive when they are in the older years, then this would actually make them very fiscally negative, right? Because it means they would just collect a lot more Social Security and Medicare. But because their survival advantage is in their early 20s and 30s, it means they pay a lot more taxes in their lifetime too.
And We've heard politicians talk about possible mass deportations as a immigration policy to undo some of the illegal immigration that has happened in the past several years. What would the fiscal impact of that be?
Yeah, so let me tell you what my priors were coming into the study. I thought it was going to be very negative because I know how much each deportation is likely to cost. And the average cost, according to many estimates, and if you look at the federal budget, is about $65,000 per person. That is a lot of money, right? And I actually created a second estimate saying, what if it's double? It's $130,000 per person. Why? Because I bet there are increasing marginal costs to deportation. It's different to find the 500,000 easiest people to deport every year than to find the 10 million people in 1 year, right? That would be much more costly. And so even at $130,000 per person, it actually reduces the budget deficit I found to deport the illegal immigrants. And the reason is I mentioned that new illegal immigrants cost $130,000 each. So you would say, well, if the deportation is $130,000, then it's a wash, right? But the people who have already lived here for decades in the U.S., illegal immigrants, are much more than 130 negative because they're older. So they've already worked for many years. The years that they have left are older years in which they're going to collect more benefits, and and they're going to earn less money and therefore pay less taxes. And as a consequence, the estimated fiscal impact of the average illegal immigrant living in the U.S. today, all of them, not just the recent ones, is negative 196,000. So deporting them actually would reduce the budget deficit over their lifetime. Now, that's not necessarily, the preferred policy. Just because of that, I posed an alternative. What if instead of deporting them, we ask the illegal immigrants to pay a fee of $100,000 to remain in the country? Now, you say, well, Daniel, that's a lot of money, $100,000. Well, yeah, but you could pay it over time in loans with interest. People give you loans for a mortgage, and the mortgage doesn't, the income from remaining in the U.S. is much larger than the rent income or savings from having a mortgage. So I bet you would get loans either from family or from people. And it would be a much preferred, I think, solution economically and socially than deporting 15 million people, right? And so that would actually be the most fiscally beneficial solution, would be to ask illegal immigrants to pay a fee. I said in my estimate that I assume 10 million people pay the fee and 5 million people don't, and those 5 million get deported. And that would raise a substantial amount, $1.9 trillion. Imagine what you could do with 1.9 trillion. The debt will be reduced by 1.9 trillion. Just 1 trillion from fees, right? 900 billion from the savings of the rest of people who are deported. It's huge.
And then what are some other immigration approaches that would actually make the deficit worse? What other ideas did you look at in the paper that would make the situation even more terrible than it already is?
Yes. So, the biggest thing that the U.S. is doing now that is very negative is that Americans can sponsor their parents to become green card holders. I know you say, well, Daniel, that's a good thing. You can bring in your parents. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing for the people who bring them. But the reality is that because they're going to be old and they're going to pay very little in taxes, and most of them don't really have a college education at all, the consequence is they're going to be a deficit for the country. They're going to receive more benefits. And so, yes, this is a good thing for the American that's bringing his parents. But that person is externalizing the cost of their parents on the rest of society. And that does seem like an unfair externality you're causing. And so I argued that you could eliminate that category, allow them to still bring their parents, but they don't get green cards. So that means they don't get Social Security or Medicare. Or you allow people to pay a fee. The problem is that the fee would be very large. It would be over 100,000. And so likely very few people would bring their family members. On the other hand, I argued that the other big policy change that should be done is expanding high-skilled immigration. And with expanding high-skilled immigration, I mean, imagine a very simple and common sense solution like if you graduate from an American university with a master's or PhD in a STEM area, so I'm not talking about people with master's degrees in film, okay? Or PhDs in gender studies. No, I'm talking PhDs in chemistry, masters in rocket, engineering, whatever, math. That would increase immigration over the long run by about 15,000 people every year. That's a very small number, okay? There have been days in the past 3 years where more illegal immigrants cross the border in a single day than this, okay? I'm talking about 15,000 people who are going to be on average a $1.5 million surplus for the federal government. Now just multiply 1.5 million times 15,000. And that's the reduction in budget deficit you get in net present value each year from maintaining this policy. That policy would also have another effect that would be very large in the first year, which is that because there are caps on the number of people who can come to the US, there's a big backlog of especially people from India waiting who do have PhDs and masters in STEM areas. And so if you enacted this policy, not only would you increase future legal immigration by 15,000, you would allow about, a few 100,000 people who are already in the US to remain, and their kids too. And so that would have a huge positive impact too from reduced immigration of those people.
And so, like I said, this paper is very long. It's very in depth. How did you write it? What went into making this paper? What sort of data did you have to look at? What sort of research did you have to do? And how long did it take?
Yeah, well, the source of this was mostly the current population survey. That is from the census. It asked people, millions of people, to report how much they pay in taxes, in every type of taxes. They impute other things, even if people don't say it, like whether they get Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security. Like the census is fixing some things if people are obviously putting on the wrong answer or made a mistake. Like if you are in your 70s and you are born in the USA and you say, and you paid taxes, but then you mark that you are not getting any Social Security, that might have been a mistake, and they have some statistical errors that fix that. And so that's what I used. I had to basically look up by the group that I chose, first for the average person, the average native-born American, so you're restricted for where you're born and all of that. How much do they pay in income taxes by age, in payroll taxes by age, adjusted for the employer share of the payroll taxes, adjusted for excise taxes. So I had to look at the consumer expenditure survey and see how much people spend on cigarettes, on flight tickets, on gasoline, to estimate how much they pay in excise taxes to the federal government. I had to, I did some adjustments too that the national academies didn't make, especially on Medicaid and Medicare, which is that more highly educated people actually cost less to Medicaid and Medicare. I'm not taking a stance as to why. That's just a fact that the government has found. And so I adjusted the cost of immigrants with more education to pay less to receive, even if they do get Medicaid, which they get it less often, the value of their Medicaid is smaller than the value of the Medicaid of a less educated person. And so that made for, I think, a more accurate calculation than previous studies. And now my study is very different from the outcomes of the CBO, for example. The Congressional Budget Office this summer released these estimates saying that the border crisis is going to reduce the budget deficit of the federal government by over $900 billion over the next 10 years. And they say that about 8.7 million people are going to cross the border and enter and overstay visas in excess of the past between 2021 and 2026. So they assume that the border crisis will continue until over a year later than today. That is very different from my estimate, which is a lifetime cost of over $1 trillion, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost the mirror.
And that's because you're looking at the lifetime and they're only looking at 10 years.
That's one of the two reasons of why they end up with a surplus. But even if I looked at the next 10 years, I would still have a small deficit, actually. Not as big as 1 trillion, but it would be a small, maybe 100 billion or something. I would need to look it up again. But the main reason is that they are not really taking into account the cost of public goods. meaning they only take into account Medicaid and Social Security and all of these things, but they don't take into account the roads. They don't take into account education. They don't take into account, and education is actually a big part. I mean, all these people bring kids too, right? And the kids go into public schools, and public schools get money from the federal government too, and translation and all these things. And so they don't include this cost, the cost of border security, for example. I'm sorry, but the cost of border security is part of the cost of immigration, right? Especially of immigration, more than the natives. I'm not even that unfair. I assign the cost of border security to the natives too. And so I add up all these costs. The military, some people will say, well, Daniel, you don't need to increase military spending if the population goes up. But you have to be careful here, because real per capita military spending in the US today is larger than at the height of the Cold War. Most people don't know that. It's smaller as a share of GDP, but it's higher in inflation-adjusted terms. And the reason is that even if more people does not necessarily mean Congress is not forced to raise discretionary spending, but they are likely to do it because they can. And so if you expand the economic pie, they will expand. I assume that they expand discretionary spending with inflation and per capita. Not with the economy, just per capita. And so that leads to simply a budget deficit. Also, they make some arbitrary assumptions about the legal status of them and who gets deported, who doesn't, that I make different assumptions. They assume that a little over 2% of the illegal immigrants will become STEM innovators, which will grow the economy. And they say that it will expand productivity. And of the 900 billion surplus, 300 billion is because they think that 2% of the illegal immigrants will become STEM innovators that are like in Silicon Valley. Look, I do believe that of the illegal immigrants, in fact, probably more, but I do not believe that of the people crossing the border. I'm sorry.
And so I think your paper is really useful because it sort of works through both of those economic stories that we started with, right? One says that immigrants will be good for the budget. One says they will be bad for the budget. And you basically find that in certain situations, both of these stories are true. What matters is not thinking of immigrants as just one block of people. We all know that immigrants are very, very different, that there's huge variety among the types of people who come to the United States. And so just thinking of immigrants versus non-immigrants is really missing a lot of the story. And so you go in and you break down immigrants into 35 different categories so that we can really understand what's actually going on. Thanks so much for doing this paper, Daniel, and thanks for talking to us about it.
Yeah, of course.
One of the top stories in the news last week was the East Coast Dockworkers Union, the International Longshoremen's Association, going on strike for several days. The strike could have lasted longer, but employers and the union reached an agreement to end it temporarily, at least until January 15th, while they negotiate further. I think it's important to understand exactly how a union like the ILA actually works, because it really is a relic of previous times. We don't have a ton of unions like the ILA anymore. We do have some, though, and I'll get to some other examples of unions that are similar to them. But in one sense, the ILA is very, very good at being a labor union. And here's what I mean by that. A labor union as an organization has two primary purposes. If it's actually doing what it's supposed to do, which means not being a political activist group, it has two primary purposes. The first purpose of a labor union is to fix the pay of its members above the market rate. If you're getting paid the market rate anyway, there's no point in being in a union. A union is supposed to raise the pay for its members. So in order to do that, it tries to negotiate contracts, make work rules, get extra benefits in order to raise the compensation above what the market would pay. So that's the first purpose of a labor union. And look, ILA does a great job at this. Based on data from 2020, a majority of the longshoremen in New York and New Jersey made over $150,000 a year. And a third of them made over $200,000. And that's not including some extra payments they get, and it's not including the value of their fringe benefits. So that's a lot of money for a job that really doesn't require very much formal education. And so the ILA is very, very good at raising the pay of its members above the market rate. And one of the criticisms of the ILA is that it encourages make-work jobs. Feather bedding is the term that's usually used, meaning there's a bunch of rules in place that require more workers to do jobs than are actually required if we had used technology instead. So this is a big part of the debate over automation. And so that can make it seem like there are too many dock workers. And in one sense, that's true. There could probably be fewer dock workers if automation technology was adopted. Although that's not entirely clear either, because a lot of times when you invent new technology, you end up creating new jobs that weren't there before. But let's say for sake of argument that it would actually reduce, and there are actually too many dock workers as it's currently constituted. The second purpose of a labor union is actually to exclude workers. It's to restrict the supply of workers. So even though in one sense, from a technological point of view, there might be too many dock workers, the ILA's purpose as an organization is to restrict the supply of longshoremen. So once it does that first thing, which is raise the pay above the market rate, if you have pay above the market rate, lots and lots of people are going to want to do that job. More people are going to want to do it than if it was at the market rate. And so now you have a gap, right? If you're at the market rate, you should be at equilibrium, in theory. And if you're at equilibrium, that means you have the same number of workers willing to do the job as you have spots open for the job. So it matches up, and everyone who wants the job is employed. All the jobs that the employers are willing to offer are filled. Now, obviously, that's in theory. It doesn't work out exactly like that in real life, ever. But in theory, you should be pretty close to something like that. But when you raise the pay above the market rate, now you have way more people who are willing to work at that pay rate than there are opportunities available. And so that's where the union comes in, especially in a lot of these states which are not right to work. New York, New Jersey being the two biggest. The union has huge amounts of power in determining who gets those coveted jobs at those very high pay rates. And so that's how the ILA exercises a lot of its power in determining who gets those jobs. And how do they do it? Do they do it based on merit? No, of course not. They do it based on connections in the union and based on seniority. So in terms of who gets in the first place, you usually have to have connections. A lot of times it's a family connection. Many of these jobs are basically inherited. It's a throwback to medieval kind of guild system where you pass down your spot to your descendants. Now, of course, everywhere else, well, I shouldn't say everywhere else. There are other areas we do this. For example, legacy admissions at prestigious universities. But a lot of people recognize that that's kind of a problem, and we really shouldn't be giving spots to people just because they're related to other people, when there could be other people who are more deserving and who might do a better job. And so the Dockworkers Union basically copies that sort of idea, and you pass down these jobs. Then once you're in, the union has tons of power deciding where you go, because again, the only reason you have that job is because you have good connections with the union. So now they get to tell you what to do. And the Waterfront Commission, which was a regulatory agency that oversaw a lot of the corruption in the ILA, they found in 2020, again, this is not ancient history, this is recently, in 2020, they found that the ILA sort of practices a form of segregation, because one of their local unions is 85% black and another one is 85% white. And the one that's 85% black has the vast majority of all black members of the ILA in New York and New Jersey. So they put them all into one local. And then they reserve a lot of the best jobs on the longshore side for the 85% white union. Now, it gets even crazier if you look down at the maintenance union. Out of maintenance workers, there are 1,072 of them in 2020, according to the Waterfront Commission. Only 25 were black. Not 25%, 25 people out of 1,072 were black. And only one of them was a woman. So this is an organization that uses a lot of its power to keep out lots and lots of people. Again, that's the point of a labor union, is to keep people out. It is not to spread the benefits to more people. Because if you spread the benefits to more people, you're diluting the power. You increase the number of people who are there, you have to pay them less if you're coming from the same total amount of money, right? And so that's what unions exist to do. They exist to exclude people, not to include them. Another example of a union that works like this, though, again, this is not exclusive to the longshoremen, is the American Medical Association. Milton Friedman wrote about this decades ago in a paper with Simon Kuznets, talking about how the American Medical Association acts as a labor union, restricting the supply of doctors through its control of medical schools and doctor certification. And because of that, physicians in the United States are very, very highly paid relative to other developed countries. And there are all sorts of work rules about what physicians have to do and what non-physicians are not allowed to do. And all of this is to protect the power of the American Medical Association and to protect the high pay, the above market rate pay of physicians. The reason they're able to do this is because they act as monopolies. Labor unions in the United States under federal labor law are monopolies. They are supposed to be monopolies. They are given government privilege to be monopolies. It's the complete opposite of the approach that the government takes to businesses. Once a union organizes a workplace, it is the exclusive bargaining agent for that workplace. That means nobody else can compete with them unless you decertify them. And so, unions use that power. And they used it to do things like shut down all of the ports on the East Coast because they can't get a 77% raise over 6 years. That was their ask, 77% raise for doing the exact same work. And they have the power to do that because of government backing. And that gets to the question now of pay for union bosses. This became a headline with the ILA strike because their president, Harold Daggett, is very highly paid. He made about $855,000 from the national union in 1 year. And then he also gets an extra salary for being president emeritus of a local union. And so you put it all together, just his pay that he gets directly from the union, he makes about $1 million a year. On top of that, I'm sure he has wonderful investment accounts that are doing fantastic. He has a Bentley. He has a mansion in New Jersey. He used to own a yacht. He just sold it relatively recently, actually, but used to have a yacht as well. And people look at this and they go, "What in the world is going on? This guy is supposed to be standing up for the working man, and yet he's living this lifestyle of someone who's rich and famous." And that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. But at the same time, CEOs of big companies, they make more than $1 million a year. In many cases, they make a lot of money. And that rubs some people the wrong way too. But in many cases, they make a lot more than union bosses do. So what's going on here? There is a fundamental difference between CEO pay and union president pay. And it's what I was talking about earlier. It's the difference between monopoly and competition. For corporations, we don't allow monopolies. Prohibit monopolies. They're illegal. And the government can come in and intervene to break up monopolies when they exist. In another situation where monopolies exist, the government supports them, things like utilities, for example. But in those situations, the government also has a ton of say in how they're run. You have things like rate commissions, setting prices, not allowing them to increase prices by so much because they're monopolies and they don't have competition. And so the government comes in and says, no, these are the prices you're allowed to charge. But for the most part, we prohibit monopolies in corporations, but we encourage them, and federal labor law is designed to make them in labor unions. And so when you're in an organization that does not face competition, that has government protection from competition, and you're making $1 million a year, that is different than a corporate CEO who might be making more than that. But what we find over the long term is that corporate CEO is tied pretty closely to stock market performance. So a CEO pay will do better on average if the company is doing better, and worse on average if the company is doing worse. And part of that is because a lot of that compensation for CEOs actually comes in the form of stock options. So there's very direct skin in the game and a very public way for that CEO to do well. And if it becomes clear that the CEO is not doing well, the shareholders will fire him or her. No such accountability mechanism exists in labor unions. This has been a huge struggle in the labor movement in the United States for the last 100 years, is having democracy within unions to try to make some accountability where membership can vote out bad leadership. But it has been a huge uphill climb. It has largely failed in a lot of respects. And in many cases, that too has only come with federal government intervention, telling unions that they have to have democratic elections. That happened with Teamsters, that happened with the UAW. Because what happens in these monopolistic organizations that do not have a public metric of their success, like share price, to point to, is that it's all politics all the way down. Now, there's plenty of politics within corporations. Absolutely there is. And a lot of corporate CEOs are very good at playing politics within their corporations. But here's the thing. If it's not delivering results, you can fool the shareholders for a little while, but they will get you eventually. Not the case for union bosses. You get guys like Harold Daggett at the ILA, who is not only the president, his son is the executive vice president, and his other son is a regional vice president. They're all making tons of money because he's able to rise up the ranks of this union. And once he gets to the top, there's nothing you can do to take him down. There is no mechanism to do that. He's the president. So look, some CEOs absolutely are overpaid, but there's a market mechanism to correct that. Does it always get used? No. Is it unfair that some CEOs still manage to get paid well despite performing poorly? Absolutely. Totally unfair. Grant that entirely. But when you have an organization that is not supposed to be profitable, like a labor union is supposed to be about representing workers, getting better pay for workers. It's not supposed to be making money for itself. And it's an organization that the government protects from competition. And you've got somebody making $1 million a year and driving around a Bentley. Yeah, that is a little bit different. And that difference is one of the top reasons that a lot of Americans don't like labor unions. 94% of private sector workers in the United States are not members of unions. And that's because one of the reasons is because they have heard stories of these union bosses for decades, going back decades. You can go back as long as you want in just about any union, and you can find these stories of union bosses spending all this money on private jets, on golf resorts, on spa treatments, and all the rest of this stuff, while the members are working their tails off and they feel like they're not making enough money. And yeah, that does rub a lot of people the wrong way. And it should. Because the only reason the union bosses are able to do that is because they have protection from competition. You can't hire them away. If a CEO is doing badly, you can compare them to other CEOs in their same industry, and you can see, does the performance match expectations? And the other thing, too, is CEOs is, the big CEOs, they make tons of money. They absolutely do. Some of it is pretty ridiculous. But CEOs of medium and smaller companies, a lot of them, they're doing well. Don't get me wrong. But plenty of them are not making $1 million a year. And so when you have a national union that comes in and tries to unionize a small company with, say, 50 employees, now you are talking about a situation where no one in that company is making $1 million a year. And yet you have a national union coming in with monopoly power and the backing of the federal government to try to unionize it. And yeah, that rubs people the wrong way. It's bullying. And it's one of the reasons why labor unions struggle to catch on in the United States. Now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let Daniel pick the paper of the episode from the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization in May 2016 by Kevin Greer and Norman Maynard, The Economic Consequences of Hugo Chavez, a Synthetic Control Analysis. Here's Daniel to tell you about it.
Well, so my favorite paper is one that is very dear to my heart because I'm from Venezuela, and it's titled The Economic Consequences of Hugo Chavez, a Synthetic Control Analysis by Kevin Greer and Norman Maynard. It's from 2016. And, it debunks this whole narrative that, Hugo Chavez reduced childhood poverty and increased literacy, all these things that you're told, same things that they're told about Cuba, when the reality is that Chavez governed mostly in a period in which oil prices went from $10 a barrel to $100 a barrel in his presidency. Imagine if the revenues of your government multiplied times 10, because it was government-owned, right? In fact, it was more than 10, because what was the profit margin on an oil barrel of $10? Maybe $1? What's the profit margin of an oil barrel at 100? It's maybe $91. So it might have been multiplied times 90. And so that should have made Venezuela become like Dubai, not like Panama, right? Yet Venezuela experienced almost no economic progress. And so what they do is that a synthetic control, what this method means is that you look at which other countries looked like Venezuela before Chavez, and then you assume Venezuela will keep looking like those countries post-Chavez. And then you compare that hypothetical with how Venezuela actually ended up looking like. And what he finds is that, for example, let me read this from you, while poverty, health, and inequality outcomes all improved during the Chavez administration, these outcomes also improved in each of the corresponding control cases, and those we cannot attribute the improvements to Chavismo. We conclude that the overall economic consequences of Chavez and his administration were bleak. And so, in fact, childhood poverty should have gone down much more. Illiteracy is something that was eliminated in like basically every country in Latin America too. Like, this is nothing special. If anything, it was really a huge waste. I joke to the students that I have and in my speeches to the kids I speak at Young America's Foundation that I shouldn't be in the United States. I should be driving a Lamborghini in Caracas. That's how Venezuela should be looking like. And instead, it's a basket case. It's the largest refugee crisis in the world. There's no gasoline in a country with the most oil reserves. It was truly destroyed by socialism. And that's why it's really cool that we have this paper that kind of debunks that scientifically.
The Economic Consequences of Hugo Chavez by Greer and Maynard. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.